This podcast is made possible by your support and your donations. Thank you. And by the purchase of my book called Everyday Buddhism, Real Life Buddhist Teachings and Practices for Real Change. I will post an affiliate link to the book on Amazon in the show notes. And if you've already read it, please take a minute to rate and review. And also consider purchasing it again for a friend or family member as a gift. Welcome to Everyday Buddhism, making every day better by applying the proven tools found in Buddhist concepts. Welcome to episode 78 of Everyday Buddhism, Making Every Day Better. In this episode, I talk with Melissa Moore, PhD, an educator in Buddhism and contemplative psychology. She has been a student of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche since she was 25 and a senior teacher in the Shambhala community for the past 40 years. Melissa is the co-founder of Karuna Training, a certification course in contemplative psychology offered as a cohort training since 1996 in 8 countries. She teaches throughout the U.S., Europe, Australia, and New Zealand, and currently serves as the executive director of Karuna North America. In our conversation, we discuss Melissa's latest book, The Diamonds Within Us, an approachable and contemporary look at how to integrate ancient Tibetan Buddhist teachings in our everyday lives. Among other things, we talk about how important it is to befriend ourselves just as we are by directly assessing the wisdom of emotions through deep listening and mindfulness, to get to know and get comfortable with our vulnerabilities, which then leads to finding our greatest strengths. And then we broaden our true compassion for ourselves to work with others, addressing fears and challenges in relationships. I so enjoyed this conversation with Melissa, as you will notice by our constant stream of giggling, and I hope you'll continue to listen to the talk with Melissa to glimpse ways to discover the diamonds within you. This conversation starts now. Okay, Melissa, I've been looking so forward to talking with you about your book, about your life, about anything you can share with us from your long history. You seem to have touched Buddhism and psychology, which is sort of your unique, conjunction here. You've touched them both since you were very young. So I'm excited to talk to you and welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you for having me on. Yes.
So I believe, first of all, before we get started, I told you this off mic, but off recording, but I believe your book, The Diamonds Within Us, is a definitive how-to book. I like how-to books in Buddhism. One of my bylines of this podcast is tips and tricks for everyday Buddhism, because I think Buddhism can have a way too serious stigma and scare people away. And unfortunately, you might lose somebody that way. So I think the more friendly we are about the whole thing, the better off.
Right.
So one of the things I shared at the beginning in the intro, I shared a little bit about your life, but since I mentioned just a bit ago that you seemingly have been intrinsically tied to Buddhism and psychology from a very young age, as I read your book, I kept discovering these profound nuggets of wisdom that I feel could have only been realized through years of disciplined Dharma practice. So,
Mhm.
what I'd like you to do is bring me and my listeners up to date in your words, about your experience in both psychology and the Dharma, and the flavor of your life experiences and personal challenges that kind of brought you to where you are right now.
Well, it's interesting because when I discovered Buddhism, of course, I wasn't looking for it whatsoever. I literally came to town with a rock and roll band in 1979 to Boulder, Colorado. And I wanted to take a dance class because I was interested in dance. And someone pointed me towards Naropa Institute on the Boulder Mall. And I took a dance class and I hated it. I hated it because they meditated at the beginning and I thought they were all elephants. I was very judgmental. And I knew that about myself. I was enough aware that I knew. And then at the end of the class, I met someone who told me all about Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, and he made it sound very exotic. So I ended up coming. I mean, I got very excited about Trungpa Rinpoche, and then I looked up the situation in Kansas City, where I was living at the time. I again went to a program, learned how to meditate, hated it. I did not have the wherewithal or self even kindness to sit with myself. I literally was in fetal position after sitting the first time. So I was someone who carried a lot of trauma and a lot of um, wildness into the meditation arena. And but I like the people, and the people were kind of wild, and I that was my magnet, and so I literally ended up in front of Trungpa Rinpoche, who was giving a refuge ceremony like 2 weeks later, and he didn't show up till 2 in the morning, and outrageous, and it I was furious about it, and it took me 8 years to sort of realize that I was studying the Dharma and to realize that I could take him as a teacher because he was very scary character. And basically, I wanted to go to Naropa because it was a real happening thing there. And I didn't, they only offered, I already had my BA and they offered 2 master's degrees. And one of them was in Buddhist studies, and I wasn't interested in that. So I went into the Buddhist psychology program because that was the only other masters they had, Buddhist contemplative psychotherapy. And somehow I got in, and I'm so grateful that I did. It was really a mishap, and or one of these what we call auspicious coincidences of
Right.
meeting my path, because here I have spent most of my life teaching contemplative psychology. I took it out of the training of therapists. So I would say that it was a long time taming my mind.
Mm-hmm.
But once, and that came through recognizing and a lot of hard luck lessons about wherever you go, your mind follows you. And then learning how to sit with myself, befriend myself, and really find the power of and the potency of my mind and my heart. And so I was, in a sense, raised by the Buddha Dharma in that way, or you could say, uh, mannered or brought up, because I had such a kind of wild upbringing that I literally learned how to eat, to set the table and eat with a knife and fork. Those kind of teachings were part of the Shambhala path. And I think Trungpa Rinpoche at the time found many Westerners quite barbarian. And so he wanted us to, you know, he took a bunch of anti-war hippies and got everybody to wear suits and ties and dress up and speak to each other with some manners. And I felt like I was sort of raised by that culture. I
How
literally
old were you? Just as an
only 24, but I
yeah.
was would say a young 24 when I arrived. I was also a trust fund baby. So I was very irresponsible around money and finances. So when I finally did get accepted to Naropa, my father cut me off. And that was the best thing that ever happened
Whoa.
to me because literally I had to learn how to open a banking account and write checks and pay my bill, and it was a very rude awakening and a very good awakening. And that was all part of my time to grow up now.
Yeah.
And that came hand in hand with learning how to sit with myself. So
Interesting. Yeah. So it was almost a a partnership of growing up um as a person, and growing up within the the Buddha Dharma. I mean,
right. And as you know, Trungpa Rinpoche, it was a wild tradition. Shambhala has its reputation for being outrageous and wild, and it
yes,
was.
could you say a little something about that now so we get that
Yeah.
out of the way?
Well, just that I can say that it was the 70s and 80s, and things were very different then in context. But I can say for myself, if it hadn't have been wild, like the kind of free love and free, I mean, there was a lot of alcohol and there was a lot of intoxicants running around and all of that. If it hadn't been like that, I wouldn't have been interested because
Right, right.
that's where I was. And so I felt like it was kind of a particular teacher arising in a particular time, bringing a very radical Dharma to the West. And we young students really didn't know what we were receiving. I maybe some people did. I'll speak for myself. I didn't really know what I was receiving and had no idea of the profundity of the path. And in many ways, Trungpa Rinpoche, he has a very outrageous tradition, but he's an incredibly orthodox teacher in terms of insisting that people learn how to sit in meditation in a kind of Dzogchen pure style before they get all the bells and whistles with the bells and dharmarus and visualization. It takes a lot of grounding. So he was very traditional in that way. And I'm really glad he was because I really learned how to sit on the ground and synchronize myself with myself and find my basic health or my basic sanity. I could actually evoke that. And I felt like I really tested my sanity and I have it. And
Mhm.
it was in a wild environment that let me emerge brilliantly sane. Isn't that weird? So,
No, it isn't weird. And as we will go on to talk about that, because your book talks about that quite a bit, is that and that's a pretty typical like I come from the Tibetan tradition, as I mentioned to you, and my listeners know that, is you don't hear that a lot in a lot of other Buddhist traditions, but you do hear that in the Tibetan tradition where your biggest failing, like whether it be anger or jealousy or ignorance or whatever, is your biggest strength.
yes,
If you transform it's the transformation part that's tricky, though.
it really is. And it's a moment to moment, according to our teachings or the teachings that I disseminate in Karuna training, it has to do with our relationship to space in everyday moment. Like how much perspective do we have in the moment? How much space do we have around our thoughts? Do we
Right.
believe everything we think, like hook, line, and sinker? That's what's true. Or do we stand back and allow our thoughts to kind of float there and look at them and like, is that true? Is there any space for discernment?
Hmm.
Because these days we're so inundated with information that
Right, right.
you to go down the rabbit hole of believing everything you think.
Which is
So
why we're in the trouble we're in, actually, I think.
actually,
That kind of explains a lot of things. But before we go too far into that part, first explain what is, contemplative psychology. I think almost anybody can like kind of, analysis figure out what that might be, but it is an actual real
yeah.
trademark thing. And what is Karuna training?
Oh,
Because
thank
this book, The Diamonds Within Us, the subtitle is Uncovering Brilliant Sanity Through Contemplative Psychology, which is attractive to a lot of people. But if they start seeing Karuna training and all this other stuff, and maybe even Shambhala, they might be scared away. So can you tell us what is contemplative psychology and Karuna training from the perspective of Karuna training?
Yeah, thank you. Well, contemplative psychology is what we have titled the certificate that you get. You get a certificate in contemplative psychology, and it's just like any other kind of psychological approach, such as EMDR or cognitive behavioral therapy. It's a specialization or a view or an approach that draws on Vajrayana Buddhism. But in its nature, contemplative, generally means prayer or can mean like communing with the sacred, so to speak.
Mm,
So this has it in our context, it has much more to do contemplative meaning up to date in time. So the psychology occurs in the present moment.
ah.
That we're working in the present moment because all the information we need is present now because it's the only moment we have. So everything that occurred before is present in our body, speech, and mind now.
Mm-hmm.
And everything that will happen after is being affected by what's happening right now.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a very potent moment. Most
Yeah,
of the
yeah.
time we miss it, right? So when we work with people, it's not that we have to go back into our histories. People can do that, and there's nothing wrong with that. But we're not looking to our history for the information because all the information is here right now and what we experience. So we become very fine tuned to our contemplative experience in the present moment. And we make friends with that and we befriend it in such a way because this body and our breath and our emotions and the way we hold it in our mind is our tool for liberation because we can, in every moment, things are arising, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're sitting there, you're driving down the street, and someone pulls out in front of you, and it's
Mm-hmm.
like reaction, right? You have that moment to be awake, or you get the whatever kind of email with a headline, or these ordinary things that happen to us, right? That we can feel ourselves constrict in the present moment, and we can train ourselves to be attuned to that bodily awareness of our energies. And we can learn to befriend that, embrace that in such a way as a teacher that it begins to bring us closer to, because all energy, all reactions are driven by wisdom, but they don't always come out that way, right? They
Right.
come out as reactive or aggressive, but all aggression has wisdom in it, but it doesn't always come out that way. It can come out very abusive and harmful. But in the core of it, there's some kind of seeing or some kind of clear seeing attached to it. So each of the energies we call in Buddhism the kleshas, the ones that trap
Mm-hmm.
us and that we become habituated in. Each one of those has a wisdom element, and that we can really become through these practices in contemplative psychology that were developed at Naropa Institute by Chogyam Trungpa. Through Maitri space awareness, we can become very attuned to excuse me, the energies as they're arising in our body and begin to not only work with ourselves, which is, I feel, something we should learn in kindergarten. You know,
Mm-hmm.
how do
Right,
we
right,
sit with discomfort,
right, right.
with sanity, but also how we work with others. And that doesn't, we've relegated that to the therapists, unfortunately, or we've relegated all that to the priests or something, but we all need to know how to negotiate in our relationships. So Karuna training, Karuna means compassion, and it's taking these teachings, these Buddhist psychology or contemplative psychology teachings into everyday life, to everyday application for anyone. So I have bank people, people who have businesses, all ages, people who do, one doesn't need, and if they are a therapist, because a lot of people who do therapeutic work are interested, there's a certain kind of unlearning that has to happen because it's authenticity training, complete authenticity training. And it's a kind of container that we create, a kind of environment that we create where we use the relationships we have with each other in the circle, in the cohort, to awaken to our mental conditioning.
That's a great answer, and I'm glad you gave some definitions for those of my audience who did not know what karuna meant, because that would
Yeah.
be my next question. And you go into this a little bit in the book, and I think it's kind of important to like touch on now. Is I think compassion is a much bandied about term, but without a whole lot of substance behind it sometimes, or a confusion more
Yeah.
like you talk about that, like it's not empathy, it's not sympathy, it's compassion. It's a whole different thing in
Right.
from a Buddhist perspective. It's
Yeah, from
yeah.
a Buddhist perspective, just like ego is a whole different thing from a Buddhist perspective. So we have to
Right,
know what language we're talking, right? But
right.
yeah, this whole thing that I'm a one woman campaign in my circles. Of course, many of the students I work with and many of the faculty I work with all use this word self-compassion. I don't like that because mainly we have a word called Maitri, which we don't have a translation for, that means loving kindness. And it's a very specific kind of loving kindness, which is what I feel people are using for the word self-compassion, but it's a kind of loving kindness of loving yourself as you are, with all your horns and your warts, not when you get better, but when you're really messed up, you love yourself.
Yeah,
That's Maitri. We don't
yeah,
have a translation for that. So people are calling it self-compassion, but compassion from a Buddhist perspective is selfless,
yeah.
complete. There's no occupation with me. You're open and present and not there in the sense that you usually are.
Yeah,
And that's a very hard place to get to because
yeah,
usually we're there and present and commenting in our head about what we're going to say next.
yeah.
It's not present. So that's compassion. It's natural to us, compassion. We see that's why how
Right.
come movies work and how come all these things, it's natural to us to feel the feelings of others fully and completely. And you know, and it's beyond sympathy. Oh, poor person. Then
Yeah,
you've gotten into the mix, right? Or empathy. I feel what you feel.
yeah,
Even that's unnecessary. Feeling,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
just
yeah,
connection. And it's so precious. And I feel that in our days of defining everything and also this Zoom world and all that, the miracles of it, right?
yeah,
Also, it's hard. We're missing that heart to heart,
yeah, yeah,
deep
yeah.
humans that we had around the campfires at night. And
Yeah. Yeah. And you and I know this because of our age. Others, I don't think do even I'm not, I mean, even the Gen Xers and the edge of the millennials, I think have a disembodied sense of being embodied, if you know what I mean,
I
because
know,
they've all been connected to their phones. And I many times think about that, as about how it was. This sounds terrible. It sounds like, I walked 50 miles to school in a snowstorm, you know, here I go. But but I have to tell you, I do often think about this, and I'm trying not to be an old get off my lawner, but it is, I think about how it was to just to just like to talk to someone without ever seeing them on Facebook, without ever texting them.
We used to drop by each other's houses.
Houses. Yeah. God forbid
God
anybody does
forbid.
that now, because we say, how rude. You didn't even text me first.
Isn't that funny?
It
I
is.
know, I know. It's humbling to think about it. Like I always wonder how I got anywhere without my phone.
Well, I know I don't get anywhere without my phone now, or my GPS in my car. I mean, it won't happen. But yeah, I really, it is so different. Or just the many hours where you would just stare out the window. I mean, it's like that's what you did. You stared out the window, or you actually read a book. Where I know
That's what
people
I
do.
loved about the pandemic. I felt like the pandemic, as much terrible sorrow that arose from it, particularly all the deaths and the children left behind. And so we can't step over all of that pain.
Right.
And it was a huge pause button on fast paced life in a way that, for me, myself, that's one reason I got the book done. But also, it
Yeah.
was like time I sat there when it came down. I was in Mexico when it hit, when the pandemic hit. And I remember when I got home finally, which was a fiasco, I sat for like 2 or 3 days just staring out the window, realizing, wow, it's
Yeah,
like
everything stopped. Yeah.
everything's,
Yeah.
and it was such a phenomena that, and of course, I sit in a very privileged situation, so I didn't go. I was ready to roll up the sidewalks with Karuna. I was like, okay, well, because I did everything, all my trainings in person for
Oh
30 years,
yeah. Yeah.
up to, everything, all these retreats and everything. So then we were like, ready to shut down Karuna, and the students were like, "Wait, this is when we need more than ever." So, for years, the younger students have been telling me, "Bring Karuna online, bring Karuna online." So I was forced.
Yeah.
And I actually feel there's a lot of things that do work online,
They do. Yeah,
and
exactly.
there's some things that don't. And so, I'm in the middle of discerning that, because I'm trying another model, and I'll try another model next year, because of a hybrid, because this whole, there's something about, I'm teaching a perspective and a perception practice. And so needing to be in the environment in such a way with people, at Zoom, we get a half body, right?
Yeah.
And there's something really different when you're,
Yeah, and but in some, I was just talking about this with my partner the other day about the about the pandemic and the pause, and that some people never did realize it, so they never learned the lesson. They were just so focused on getting things back to how it was
oh,
pre-pandemic. It's like, I think, if particularly if you have a spiritual practice, it was easier to pick up on. But I
oh,
think if you were rushing around and you just stop, you were just, a lot of people, I've talked to
with
a lot of people that
people with kids,
kid
that's a
that
whole
that was,
other,
yeah, it was just very frustrating, and they wanted it to be over, and I get that. But there's another thing that, like you mentioned, about like you weren't online and then you had to get online. I have always been virtual, so I didn't have to do that. But a lot of Buddhist temples weren't online, and they had to come online. And what a boon for people who were looking for a little bit of dharma. They had a
right,
little time, they were able
right.
to sample some of those things. So there's always that good stuff.
Mixed
But
blessing, mixed
yeah,
blessing.
mixed blessing. But okay, so, and that actually gets me to not knowing. See,
Yeah,
part one, because it's a good, I think that's a good segue, because it's, I don't know mind, and there's so many great Zen stories about not knowing in beginner's mind, like the
right.
master and the tea, and there's a million not knowing great stories. But not knowing is something that was so frustrating to many in the pandemic, because it was, well, what the heck is this? We don't know how to handle this. And we don't, we no experience with things that we didn't do already, or where's it going to go? And that's why I think there was so many people like um going to their separate corners in their tribes, because
Right.
they looked to somebody who told them what was going to happen, and so then they believed that, and then the other person looked to whoever that. But yet nobody really knew. The scientists didn't know
No,
because
and
it
we
was a
still
novel
don't.
virus.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and we
it
still
still
don't.
don't know, and we still don't know. And so but not knowing, the not knowing mind is so important to Buddha Dharma, the practice. And so it's something I talk and write about a lot, but it was in our internet culture, we think we think we know everything, or we think if we don't know everything,
We can
we
Google
can
it.
we can in like 1 minute I can get on my phone and I'll know that, and then I'll know that for sure, right?
Yeah.
And you wrote this about contemplative psychology, which I really liked. I'm going to do a quote from your book. I hope you don't mind. uh, Contemplative psychology is a path of retraining ourselves to not make things up in our minds, but to rest in not knowing and learn to tolerate the intensity of discomfort. That was like the pandemic. We train to go toward emotional energy and open to it for the wisdom that is innate within the messiness of feelings, unquote. Loved that. Can you talk more about this process and how it relates to the overall practice that you teach?
Well, I think, it describes it really well. It's counterintuitive. Like, for example, when we're sitting with anger, or we're sitting with even, like, for example, grief and sadness, or really confusing things like the pandemic, like when we feel threatened, that society, or all the threats that we're facing in society with the guns today and all of that,
And
right?
climate change and
Climate
right.
change, all of it. So this is why I feel that contemplative psychology is so necessary for this time, and I should be training kindergartners, because
Mm,
it's this notion that being human, you are going to experience discomfort just through the simple act of birth, old age, sickness, and death,
death,
right?
right.
You can't get away from that. But we don't have to put another hat on top of a hat, unnecessary, to create the all the ways that we create suffering, avoiding birth, old age, sickness, and death, right?
Yeah.
So that kind of understanding, first of all, and having the space and discernment on the kind of suffering that you're having is really important. And so that's kind of the mental aspect, is understanding that suffering's here, that you have it, that others have it, that you're not alone. And is this suffering you're creating? Or is this suffering that just comes with being in a human body, like the loss of a child, or the tragedies of life that we don't have any control over, floods and fires and those things. So basically, what the training is to go towards that discomfort in a way and hold it close to you as a teacher, because generally we're managing our feelings in such a way that we're discoordinating, we're desynchronizing ourselves in our panic to get a solution together, right?
Right.
Like, either in our mind we're trying to figure it out, in our emotions we might be acting out in one way or another and causing more harm and then in our bodies running around like chickens with their heads cut off, right? So this kind of bringing ourselves together and coming close to ourselves, counterintuitive, and then taking it to heart, letting it work on us, because there's wisdom within us that we don't know about. And
Yeah.
so until it dawns, which it will if we give it enough space and train ourselves on how to proceed. And I always say, if you don't know what to do, do nothing.
Yeah, right, right. Which
Right?
is which is wise action. I mean, that is
Yeah,
action. Action is
right,
non-action, right?
right. So this whole notion of not knowing is our state all the time. It's actually our home. It's where we live. but can we be comfortable with that? And it kind of is like being a child of illusion, right? It's like, wow, it's like the display is remarkable. And then, but it's very hard. And I've found this in myself. I've been teaching this for a very long time. But when things have gotten really extreme, i.e., Donald Trump world and all this guns and all of this stuff, when things get extreme, I'm as reactive as the next person.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
you don't get out of that. So the practice, it's not like we're getting anywhere, right? In fact, the world is getting more alarming, it looks like, because I think, not because actually it's any different than it ever was, but the way that we're accessing it is constant. Every little
yeah.
device and phone and everything, we have
Yeah.
information, so it's coming in at us, and our nervous systems, frankly, aren't evolved to handle it. So, myself, I have to remember, like, I'm as addicted to this mechanism as anyone else because, I run my business through my phone,
Yeah,
basically.
she's holding her phone, by the way.
Anyway, so I don't know. So I think
Yeah,
not to judge that. It's where we are, it's the mechanisms, like driving a car, and all the ways in which we are wired together these days.
I'm so glad you revealed a bit of yourself there, because I do it all the time, so welcome to my world. I mean, it's like I don't hide much of anything in my podcast because I think that one of the problems that I don't really consider myself a teacher necessarily, even though I'm empowered to teach. I like to think of myself as a spiritual friend, yeah, because I think that's what everybody needs right now, because we're all so screwed up. I mean, really.
And we need each other, right?
Yeah, we need each other. Exactly. But one of the things that in you telling that story, I think the brilliance of what you just said was that because it started out by saying we open up or go into the discomfort, and I think there's this natural human proclivity to believe that once we get past this little bit of discomfort, then everything is cleared away and everything will be good. And
We
as
just
we
get better at being with discomfort.
or not, or
I mean,
not.
if we train in coming close to it and befriending it, the world is full of pain.
Oh, it is.
And so you just raise your gaze and take in the world, you'll be crying because the truth is it's heartbreaking.
It is, and see,
Everywhere.
and what you just said about the, um, I'll just say, I've kept saying it's like life is getting so horrible, and this, I mean, and like you just said, and that's how and it's like, oh my God, I'm 70 years old. It should be getting. Life should be easier. It shouldn't be so screwed up. I shouldn't be so panicked all the time. I
Yeah,
shouldn't be so mad all the time. I shouldn't be saying bad words to the
I
TV and the phone all the time. This is not how it's supposed to be.
But I mean, I think really it's TMI, too much
Much and
information coming at us 24/7. Think about it. I mean, it's pretty, if you turn on your computer or you're connected to the world through your phone, it's just
it's
constant.
every
Or
what
I got my husband an e-watch for his birthday, and now the damn thing is like on his wrist constantly
so
and constantly beeping, and it's like, it's amazing. It's just, we are wired
yeah,
to
it
connect.
it and it is, and back in, and I do, that's another thing I think about, like I said, clearly here I am doing the walking 29 miles to school in the snow, but it's like back in earlier times, when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s, and then when I was a teenager and a young adult in the 70s and 80s, even then there was not all that information. And we didn't know what goofy things some politician did in some other, we didn't know any of that because it wasn't that available to us
Not at all.
unless we read the papers constantly or we were something like that. It just wasn't that available. And so it's not our fault that it's getting hard. It's just it's just maybe we're like you said, maybe we're just, this is our a better, it's a harder training ground, right? You know how
Right.
they.
And I notice for myself, like I do like often wake up and I'll look at my phone just to see what I have to do in the day. And then if I go into my emails, I know better than to open any emails. I just see who's written me. And then if I go to the news, I
Oh,
know better. It's the hard part. To look at headlines, but not to get into the weeds because or even if I get into the weeds with something, if I have some time and then I might read a special interest story, not something that's going to get me screaming at the top of my lungs in the shower. So it's like I'm having to learn this, at
yes,
66. I'm having to be incredibly discerning. And then we have a kind of rule like we have coffee together, my husband and I, and no phone, a
right.
no phone zone. And so, I mean, this is dumb, but it's like we're having to put rules around all of it because
Yeah,
anyway.
well, yeah, it
It,
is. But let's go to a good thing now.
okay. Like,
We spend a little time suffering together here, and so I'm glad to be with you in all of this.
yes.
Um, but intrinsic health is a concept you used, and you tied it to Buddha nature a bit. You write about intrinsic health and how it is sort of connected to Buddha nature. And I believe that the Buddha nature concept, or I call that the opposite of original sin, is
Mhm.
so important in learning to live a lifestyle of curiosity, of reflection rather than reaction. Because if we truly believe, which it's hard to convince anybody that they have that intrinsic health or Buddha nature, I find. But if we truly believe that we have that intrinsic health or Buddha nature, then we may not try so hard to improve ourselves.
Totally. That's the whole point. Yeah.
And or putting on, I thought you talked about hats on hats, or
Yeah.
putting on masks or other identities to bury what is underneath, like showing all the wonderful healthy food you put on your Facebook,
Yeah.
yet you had just finished the McDonald's. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's like we
Cultivating
we do. And I think in that rush to improve ourselves, we're almost posing for ourselves rather than getting to know what's really in there.
right.
So
Yeah.
say more.
Well, one of the chapters in my book is what is health, because that word has been co-opted by the advertising world to mean a lot of things, right? So we put healthy. Well, what is really healthy? I mean, and it has to do much more with how we hold our experience as much as the actual things we do.
Right.
And also, this, when I'm talking about this intrinsic health, it's like a seed syllable of resilience within us.
I love it.
And health is an important topic um, um, because we have this notion of, because of original sin in the West, and this whole notion that we did something wrong and therefore we have to um, you know what is it,
Atone.
confess and atone ourselves. Well, how that translates around health is, um, I did something, or I'm unhealthy and therefore I did something wrong, right? So there's a lot of shame and blame, and like a lot of people when they get diagnosed with things, it's like, how did I get this? What did I do wrong? Instead
Yeah.
of just, understanding that despite what our diagnosis is, despite whatever labels we might be carrying clinically, that there is a seed syllable of health in us that has to do with the capacity to synchronize our bodies, our breath, and our mind in the present moment. We can touch it. We can find this moment of wholesomeness where we're not occupied with ourselves. It's a
Yeah.
moment of openness, and there's tremendous health in that, experiential health, uplifted, uprising, breath, inspiration. And we can cultivate a relationship with that aspect. It takes time, and a lot of us have a lot of mental conditioning to the contrary, right?
Right.
So I was someone like that. And so yeah, this is
It,
why I no longer practice in a therapeutic thing, because I feel like the whole medical model is so colonized to make wrong, particularly women, but also
yeah.
people of color and everything else. The kind of um, top-down labeling and diagnostic work, even though most people who practice understand there's a difference between the languaging around it, it's how you hold someone. And if you come in, like I used to work with people who suffered with florid psychosis, there's millions of moments of clarity in the midst of chronic psychosis. It's not a solid state of mind, like no state of mind is solid. And
Right.
so in Naropa, we're kind of trained in the clinical world to offer ourselves as a vehicle of intrinsic sanity when we're working with disturbed people. And people feel that. They
Yeah.
experience that.
Yeah.
They get it. They go, oh, human being, right? It's just a
Yeah.
feelable context of warmth and openness. And, the nervous system lets go, right? And then, so this is, this psychological world, it's a very young science.
Yeah.
It's used to harm a lot of people.
Yeah.
It's got a lot of, as we say, drip. That's a Tibetan word, drip.
Right.
It's
Right. Right.
like karma on it. It's got a lot of drip on it, and so one has to be incredibly discerning around these concepts and ideas and how they're applied.
Yeah. And, say just uh explain seed syllable. I mean, I understand it because
So
I was
seed
Vajrayana.
syllable is
Yeah.
is like the very um exactly like, well, how much should I say? Um, we say a seed syllable is it's understood that everything grows out of space, right? First, there's nothing, then there's a dot of and so in nothing is the form. There's nothing, openness, that's body, and then there's speech, which is a seed syllable of something. Like it can be an emotion, it can be um, but the seed syllable of health is there, right? The seed
I got
syllable
it.
of
Yeah. Yeah.
love is there.
Right.
It's
Good.
it's already comes with us. It's part of the makeup. And the seed syllable, and then that from there comes thoughts and then comes actions, right? So out of that seed comes our view, how we hold the world, and our actions. So it's body, speech, and mind.
Right. And most people, you know, it's I think it's our culture. It's I don't know what it's also the times. But most people, I think they feel you either got it or you don't kind of thing. There's no potential. It's like thanks to emptiness, there's a potential for everything.
Right.
But but
I guess
there
a belief in basic badness or something
ex,
like that.
ex,
There's like we have something really bad that we have to mend or something. And
yeah.
that's the opposite of Buddhism. That's right.
Yep, it is. And now on to meditation and emptiness, because I'm going to kind of swing into both of those things. I should have done with emptiness first because I just mentioned it, but that's okay. I love what you wrote about meditation as being, because meditation is one of the the practices that you use to get in touch with what's inside of you, both your intrinsic health and your ugly stuff, right?
Right.
and then, but your line, I burst out laughing on this one, is being a practice to aerate our minds. I loved aerate because that's such an easy way to um describe something that many see as hard or
It is hard to
impossible.
meditate.
It
Problem.
well, I think a lot, I come at this maybe a little differently than, because I didn't have as much trouble meditating for whatever God knows,
Yeah.
or Buddha knows
Yeah.
whatever reason.
Right.
Um, but um, but one of the things I don't like about the concept of sort of like reinforcing that notion that meditation is hard is that people won't ever try it and they'll give up very fast because they think meditation is hard or impossible or something that others do correctly that they could never do correctly. But aerating sounds just that's just digging up the weeds, and it's just giving it a little air into it, and it sounds kind of easy or something. It sounds more like a process rather than the end product. And I think most people, when they come about meditating, they think they have to reach the end product in the first time they meditate.
Oh, right. Yeah, that's true. Going after a result. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I think that it would be better if it were called befriending yourself.
I do too.
Like sitting down and befriending yourself or being with yourself or something.
I like being with yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, just being with yourself. So, depending on how we arrive on the path, and we all arrive differently, some people sit down and they go, "Oh, finally, space. Oh my God, I've been waiting to sit here." And other people sit down and they go, "Ah, space. I can't sit here. I've got things to do. Are you kidding?" And it's all about our style, right?
Right.
And so, either way, on the meditation cushion, you have to meet yourself as you are. And I
Yeah.
think, and you have to befriend that, how it is. You're not going to, it's not to change yourself. In fact, and even we approach meditation, I always think as Westerners, we think, I'm going to try this. And then we approach it like we're going to put on, if you went into a store and you saw some beautiful clothes and you didn't look at the size and you just said, I'm going to try this on.
That's right.
Right. Because it's this, that's like, you're not going to fit into everything or everything that's offered to you. Right. So I think this process of making meditation work and finding your way to relax with yourself, eyes closed is a very different experience than eyes open.
Right.
Following the breath is very different than counting. And one thing I love about Michael Pollan's book about, another book called Altered Traits. Did you see this
Oh,
book?
yes,
Altered
yes,
Traits
yes.
by Richie Davidson.
I haven't read it, but I've
Oh,
heard
it's
of it.
fantastic because it's science that they've
Right.
done. But what I love is they finally understand through mind imaging how different meditations have different effects on the mind.
Wow.
So the closed eye meditation takes you into peace. So when we're stirred up and freaking out, it's a good idea to close your eyes and come inside yourself. But when you want to wake up and be with your circumstances as they are, when you want to be fearless, practice with your eyes open in the space you're in, right?
Right.
That trains you into the present moment with things as they are. Very different effect on the mind. So this is a science. I mean, like, and we can find ways like how we sit, and I'm a big believer, like anyone can meditate, to your point, like that you don't have to make it harder, right? By trying to fit yourself into a box.
Yeah. Yeah.
But to approach it from a perspective of tasting the effect of it, noticing what your mind does with it, right?
Right.
And so I don't think it's always seated that way. Often when you get meditation instructions, like you do it this way.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's like, I don't present it that way. I think try it on.
Yeah.
Figure out what works for you. Try this, try that, and become nuanced in your awareness on how the practice is affecting your mind. So,
Yeah, and everybody does respond differently, but I was always taught like that. I was taught right away when I first learned to meditate about whether your eyes were closed or whether your eyes were open, whether your eyeballs went up or whether they went
Yeah,
down, and the
yeah.
significance of that and how
Oh,
that
totally.
changed.
It affects it.
It totally changes because I kept falling asleep when I meditated, and so they
Right,
said you need to roll your eyes back up and up,
right.
look, pretend like you're looking up instead of looking down at the floor in front of you, but continue to look well, with your eyes open, and you won't fall asleep. And I never did fall because I used to like my crash into the closet. So and another thing when I first meditated, this is just the funny stories, and I think people like this stuff so they know how that they're not stupid. But another thing, when I first learned to meditate, I could not follow my breath.
Right.
I hyperventilated every single time. And I remember my first meditation class, I raised my hand like a dope. There was a lama there and a couple other people there, and I said, "How do you do this without hyperventilating?" And everybody just looked at me like I was nuts. Like they didn't understand why would I be hyperventilating. It was like, well, don't you hyperventilate when you look at your breath so much? Aren't you? I mean, so I had to learn to meditate by listening to sounds.
Uh-huh. Great. Yeah. So
That
see,
was
so you found methods, and there's so many methods of
well,
mind.
I can do breath now, but
Yeah.
I couldn't at
Right.
first. But there are
Yeah.
so many methods, and I think it's so nice that the one nice thing about information being available is that that information is now available.
Yes. And we're in a different era of, the mindfulness movement has done its work. And, I mean, so many people are learning the benefit of synchronizing their body, breath, and mind in the present moment is incredibly beneficial,
It
just for
is,
calming down the nervous system, for starters.
yeah,
All the trauma work that people are starting to really understand. So we're in a wonderful time in that way.
in that way.
It's,
Let's let a couple other things I wanted to get at before we will look like I have a few more notes here, but whenever it shouldn't be too long. Um, another thing we talked about emptiness. And I
yeah,
said before that nothing is possible without emptiness. And you refer to, or in your Karuna training, refer to emptiness as unbound openness, which is,
yeah.
I love that unbound openness. I like just both words together there. Um, and um and that's good, and that circles back to the space concept that you were getting at before.
Yeah.
Is there any other little things you want to add to like
I,
space
yeah, I'll
and
just
openness?
note that unbound openness is a quote from Judy Leaf, who
Yes, it was Judy Leaf, that's right.
has her own beautiful body, and she was a teacher for me when I was a student at Naropa. So, and she told that at a Buddhist Christian conference, because
Oh,
Christians
perfect.
are like, emptiness. What is this empty? It's pretty dead to me. And she called it unbound openness, and it made me cry when I heard it. And then
Yeah,
so so I stole that ever since. But
it's
this
perfect.
this notion of it's like I'll bring it to a Native American, because I just had a teaching from someone named Duncan Grady, who's a Blackfoot, and he talks about eagle's view versus
Ah.
mouse view.
So she's opening
Yeah,
her
I'm
arms.
opening my arms to eagle's view, the perspective of eagle's view, open mind, wide mind, to
Right,
mouse view, right?
right.
He talks about those different perspectives, which are on a continuum, which is what I like about this notion of emptiness. It's not like this openness occurs in degrees, right?
Yeah.
We soften and the mind widens. We soften towards vulnerability and the mind widens. And it goes directly with our ability to um, trust and be touched.
Right.
We open in accord to trust and relaxation, right? And
Mhm.
so we can condition that in our being. We can, just like we
Yeah.
can condition the trauma, can
Right.
condition us in a way to constrict. We can condition ourselves to open. And so anytime we hit one of those not knowing panics, we can train ourselves to use the energy that we're feeling, like fear in our heart or the gut clench or whatever it is. If our family member has said something they've said a million times that we can't say, we hold that and just like almost like move close to it in a way. We soften towards it in a way
Right.
that lets us relax and open. So it might be just a little bit of opening, but at least we're not in our fight or flight, right? So we're
Right.
learning how to soften ourselves towards everything because, we're soft bodied beings,
Yeah.
not holes, we're very tender.
Right.
We're very tender and vulnerable in our nature. And somehow that didn't get prized in the patriarchy. So we have
No,
to prize
no,
it because
no.
it's such a beautiful thing, like whenever, I don't know, I have an 18-year-old little pug. She's blind and deaf and she can't walk and she just so loving in her presence. And and I can feel that because I'm open to her, right? And so
Right.
this openness allows us to value everything.
Yeah, that's the vulnerability thing you were touching on before. And that is this talks to the compassion and exchange thing that you talk about in Karuna training. I think unless you can get there with yourself,
Right.
open to the vulnerability of yourself, which mostly we push away, like in trauma
Right.
work. I mean, I've gone through trauma, so I understand that, and it's like, uh you bury, you push away, you compartmentalize, you have all these methodologies to deal with it other than dealing with it, right? Other than
Right.
looking
Yeah.
at other than feeling it. And
Yeah.
it's like you
Exactly.
my therapist told me, you've spent all your life being very good at not dealing with this at all.
And
So,
that's an art. I mean, it's an art in itself. It's like those coping mechanisms that we have. We shouldn't demonize those either because they also save our lives, right?
well,
Sometimes. So, and so,
yes.
this is the thing, like the thing about psychology we have to be careful about. If it's got a lot of right and wrong, good and bad in it.
Oh, good
And the
point.
world
Yes.
is not like that. The world
No.
is in gradations, right? It's good today and bad tomorrow. Right? It's like look at the food industry. I mean,
No, that's true. I have an autoimmune illness and systemic lupus, and it actually caused me to go bald this year.
wow.
With alopecia, as I was pointing out to you. Well, not that I didn't have to point it out to you. You saw I was bald, but but it's funny on these forums where people ask, will my hair grow back? Will this happen? Will that happen? It's like, well, there I'm sorry to tell you, there is no answer to this, because if you have any experience with autoimmune diseases,
Right,
most people are used to going to the doctor and getting something, because that's the model, right? It's
right,
like you were saying, that's the model. It's like, they're going to fix you all up. Don't worry, they're going to fix you all up. They're going to give you this or they're going to give you that. Well, I've lived with this illness my whole life, and pretty much I learned that no, they're not going to fix me all up. And probably what they give me is going to make me feel worse and probably make everything worse.
yeah,
And it's like, I'm perfectly content telling my doctors, sorry, you don't have a big enough toolbox. You don't understand this yet. So I'm going to do my own thing and deal with it.
right.
So people are not used to it really comes back to that unknowing, the state of not knowing. But there is that sense, like you said, the pathologizing um psychological conditions, pathologizing anything,
Addiction, all of it, the stigma and
but
all.
yeah, exactly. But it's like, if we can, and I think the beauty of your book that you can get from this, really, if I were to sum it up in like just a couple of words, I would say the beauty is that it's the exploring how to be vulnerable and open, or making friends with yourself, as you said, is what's going to help you make friends with everyone else. Because if you're, people get on the bodhisattva path, they think they're on the bodhi. Well, how can, this unbelievable job that you're taught that you have to do as a bodhisattva is save all beings, right? But it's like impossible, can't do that. But you can, because all you have to do is open to yourself, right? And
Yes,
then it
and it's
goes.
genuinely open to yourself, because as we know, like Buddhism and meditation can be used just like everything else to bypass certain
Yeah,
ourselves that we don't like. I'm just going to sit here in bliss, in space, in my little God realm, and you know, and instead of you know, the deep work that it takes. And I have to be totally transparent too, and I am always with Karuna students that, you know, I've been teaching this stuff forever, and I'm the first one, like when something like a headline comes or someone cuts me off in traffic, I'm very reactive. So you teach what you need to learn, right? So it's like I can be so reactive so quick, but I've also learned to notice when I'm reactive.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
worth so much. And then I have a choice. Am I going to act this out just because it's fun? Or am I going to, really work with this? And usually that answer to that, which way I go, depends on the circumstances I'm in and the cost of it, right? I'm afraid. It's like, because it's, this mental conditioning we come with is very deeply ingrained in us. And
yeah, yeah,
that some of us are reactive and emotional. I mean,
yeah.
I'm probably never going to change that in this life, and I can kind of okay, be responsible for my mind.
Yeah, well, I had a teacher that said, they used to go to retreats, and then these people would gather around afterwards, and they'd come up to him and say, I've been meditating and practicing the Dharma for 20 years, and not a doggone thing has changed. And he would say, well, then you're not practicing, because the deal is not so much that you have changed, it's that, like you said, and I always tell the people in my podcast and in my sangha, it's if once you noticed a thing about yourself, like being reactive, in my case, reactive and anger, it goes and go along. I have
Yeah,
both of those things
me
really
too.
bad, really bad.
Me too.
Oh, good. Here we are bonding again. But the thing about it is that is like, um, I used to just do it and then notice it like a couple days later when the shit hit, when you had to deal with the consequences. Now I know it as soon as it's happening.
Yeah,
And like you said, it's that the time between the doing it and knowing that you're doing it is the sign of the practice, right? If that
right,
shrinks, your
right,
practice is good. But
right.
you're, like you said, you that's the one good thing about Buddha Dharma. You always have the option to act like a jerk anyway, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, it's just such a great, wearing off, like, not even like the slightest of a fingernail's width. Uh,
Right.
like just tiny slivers of awareness that wear down these
Right.
habits of mind so that you become more attuned to your effect on other people.
Exactly.
And,
Exactly.
we're the last to see our effect on other people often. So,
Although we do, or sometimes we see it, and in my case I'll say sometimes I see it, especially with people very, very close to me,
yeah.
and it still doesn't stop me for whatever reason. So but there's Melissa, I there's so much more we could talk about. I'd love to have a million hours here, but I'm going to be mindful of your time.
Thanks.
But before we close, is there anything else that you'd like to mention or say that I didn't mention or ask or?
No, but I just want to commend you, Wendy, for holding a forum about everyday Buddhism, because that's when, in my opinion, when the Dharma, when rock meets bone, is like how we bring it. It's all very exotic and everything still, Buddhism, but really it's so practical. It's so
Exactly.
practical and so helpful. And so when one doesn't need to be a Buddhist to practice.
Right.
And so the thing that I feel is like this body of wisdom is so it's human practice. That's
Yeah.
it. And so you've really created. I liked your title of your podcast and your approach because you really want to bring everything to earth. So thank you for that. I commend you.
Oh, and thank you. And I will encourage everyone to read your book. I am going to put links into the show notes and everything. And we'll say goodbye now, and hopefully we'll meet again
I
at
hope.
when you write another book or something. Okay.
Thank you so much, Wendy.
Thank you. That's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed and were inspired by the conversation between myself and Melissa as much as I was. Next up, some announcements. Don't forget that you can join me and our Sangha mates in the private donation supported Everyday Sangha, which meets virtually via Zoom every other week on Saturday mornings at 10 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time. The Sangha is currently at the beginning of a new format and a new book study, so now would be the perfect time to consider joining. And also, consider supporting the efforts of this podcast and all the related groups by becoming a community member for $5 a month. If you do, you will have access to blogs, members-only podcasts, an education series, a private community platform that's not on Facebook, the Introduction to Buddhism class, and the new bonus contemplation podcasts. Also coming soon is a new partner to my Substack journal that I keep, which is free. One of the things that I'm featuring now in my Substack writings is something called Sutra Snippets. Sutra Snippets is a little everyday glimpses from different sutras of my choosing. Something that's going on now, but I will soon be announcing an adjunct audio version of my Substack journal, and it's called Everyday Buddhism Off the Cuff. It's kind of like a little podcast, but it's off the cuff because it's just me rambling about my Substack journal. Sometimes it's just a voiceover, or I could also just do some random talking about what I wrote on my Substack. So look for that. I'll let you know when it happens. And if you don't follow me or Everyday Buddhism on any social media platforms we post in, you can go to the Everyday Buddhism website and join the membership community or the Everyday Sangha. Go to www.everyday-buddhism.com and click on the tab that says Join Community or Sangha. I can't stress enough how important it is to this podcast and to the related groups to receive your donations. I don't seek any sponsors. I don't ask for financial commitments through paid podcast memberships like private podcasts. So my work and the cost of the infrastructure needed to support what I do is completely self-funded, except for your donations. And I must say, this is getting harder and harder to maintain with the rising cost of everything these days. And I'm sure you feel it too. So I can understand if it's not something you are ready to do. But a one-time donation would be great. Or there are other ways to help me out. You can consider a one-time or continuing donation through Patreon or the donation tab on my website. and which you can find the links to these things on my show notes. You can also rate, review the podcast, because the more people you share the podcast with, the better off it is for me and the podcast, and the better off it is for my membership community. It drives more people to it. And it's important to share the podcast with others if you find it helpful in your life. If you could take a minute just to comment so people will know why you love everyday Buddhism. So that's it for all the announcements. Until next time, keep finding ways to make yours and everyone's days better.